Where is he? Where is Master Sergeant Foster? I need to see him today." That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted, not threatening, just a retired three-star general's voice, steady and urgent, standing on my son's front porch in full dress uniform, asking a question my own family hadn't bothered asking themselves in over a year. But we'll get there. 6 weeks before that afternoon, I was sitting in a small shared room at Willowbrook Care Center, the kind of room with a single window that looks out over a parking lot instead of a garden, listening to a nurse's aide explain, gently, that my son hadn't called back about the quarterly care plan review for the 3rd month running. I remember the exact moment she set down her clipboard and said, "Mr. Foster, I don't say this to upset you. I just want you to know somebody here is keeping track of how long it's actually been." And I remember doing the math myself, quietly, the way I'd learned to do most things by then. 14 months since my son Bradley had visited, 11 since my daughter Carol had called, and considerably longer than either of them probably realized, because time moves strangely when nobody's marking it for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Edwin Foster. I'm 74 years old. Before Willowbrook, I lived alone in a small house at the edge of a quiet town. The same house my wife Marion and I bought the year I finally left active service after 26 years. The last 14 of them as a master sergeant in an infantry unit that saw more than its share of difficult places. Marion passed 8 years ago. After that, I managed well enough on my own for a long while, right up until a bad fall 2 years ago left me needing more daily help than a house alone could provide, which is how I ended up at Willowbrook in the first place, with my son's full agreement and, at the time, his promise to visit regularly. That promise held for about 4 months. I have a small shelf in my room at Willowbrook where I keep a handful of things: a photograph of Marion on our wedding day, a paperback Western I've read more times than I can count, and a small wooden box I don't open often, because what's inside it belongs to a version of my life I stopped discussing with most people a long time ago. Here's the thing about me, that my children grew up mostly not understanding, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in that wooden box their entire lives. 26 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and a particular afternoon in a location I still don't name easily, an afternoon that earned me a Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest decorations this country gives, awarded for an action I've described in full detail to exactly 4 people in my life, 3 of whom were there with me, and the 4th of whom was Marion. When I came home and Bradley and Carol were young, Marion and I made a decision, the same decision a lot of men of my generation made. We didn't want our children measuring their father against medals and citations, treating me like some kind of legend instead of just their dad. We wanted them to know me as the man who taught them to fish, who sat through every school function in a folding chair too small for him, who cried without shame at both their weddings. So the wooden box stayed mostly closed, and we simply didn't discuss that part of my life very often at home. Bradley grew up, built a career in commercial real estate, married a woman named Denise, and settled into a comfortable, busy life that increasingly had very little room in it for a father who, from his perspective, had always been quiet, unremarkable, and, once the fall happened and Willowbrook became necessary, mostly inconvenient to accommodate. I want to be honest about the years leading up to Willowbrook, because I think they matter to understanding what happened after. Bradley wasn't cruel to me, not in any dramatic way. He was simply busy, in the specific modern way that lets a person genuinely believe they care about someone while consistently finding reasons not to show it. Visits that were supposed to be weekly became monthly, then became occasional, then became largely a matter of holiday obligation. Phone calls squeezed between work commitments, conversations that rarely lasted longer than it took him to ask if I needed anything and hear me say, out of habit more than honesty, that I was fine. Carol lived further away, in another state entirely, and her absence, while more understandable given the distance, followed roughly the same pattern. Good intentions steadily eroded by the ordinary business of her own life, until a phone call every few months became the full extent of our relationship. There was a Thanksgiving, about a year and a half before that afternoon on Bradley's porch, when I asked, gently, whether I might come stay with the family for the actual holiday itself, rather than receiving a visit at Willowbrook a few days later. And Bradley explained, with genuine-sounding regret, that Denise's parents were hosting this year, and that the logistics of bringing me along would be a lot, a word he used often in those years to describe anything involving my actual presence rather than my convenient absence. There was a phone call, maybe 8 months before that, when I mentioned to Bradley, as casually as I could manage, that I'd had a difficult week, a minor infection that had required a hospital visit, and he responded with genuine concern in the moment, promising to come by that weekend, a promise that quietly dissolved into a rescheduled visit the following month, then the month after that, until the specific incident simply stopped being mentioned by either of us. There was an occasion, a wedding anniversary that would have been mine and Marion's, when I asked an aide, almost embarrassed to be asking at all, whether she might help me call Bradley that evening, and he answered, sounding surprised to hear from me on a Tuesday, distracted by something happening in the background of his own house, and the call lasted perhaps 4 minutes before he had to go. There was a birthday, mine, the year after that, when nobody visited at all, and the aide who brought me a small cupcake with a single candle, unprompted, out of what I understood to be simple kindness rather than obligation, sat with me for 20 minutes because she noticed, correctly, that I didn't especially want to be alone that particular evening. I didn't complain about any of this, not really, not out loud to anyone who might have carried the complaint back to my children. I told myself, the way people in my position often do, that they were busy, that their lives were full, that I understood. Even when understanding cost something, I rarely let myself examine too closely. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that an old friend of mine, a man named Colonel Raymond Ellis at the time we'd served together, had spent the better part of 30 years rising through the ranks to become a retired 3-star general, and had recently been asked to help organize a 50th anniversary commemoration event honoring the specific unit and operation where my Distinguished Service Cross had been earned. The event's organizers had been trying, for months, to track down every surviving recipient of decorations from that operation, and my name, buried in decades-old paperwork, had proven surprisingly difficult to locate. My address hadn't been updated in military records since before Marion passed, and the trail had eventually led, after considerable effort, to my son Bradley's address, the most recent contact information anyone could find associated with my name. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Willowbrook, was that I was sitting in the common room doing a crossword puzzle badly, the way I usually did, when an aide came to find me with an unusual note of excitement in her voice, saying there was a phone call for me, someone claiming to be an old friend trying urgently to locate me. It was Ray. I hadn't heard his voice in almost 15 years, not since a chance meeting at another old friend's funeral, and hearing it again, warm and immediately familiar despite the years, undid something in me I hadn't expected. "Eddie," he said, using a nickname nobody had called me in decades, "I've spent 3 months trying to find you. I went to an address that turned out to be your son's house. Nobody there seemed to know exactly where you'd ended up, which, frankly, concerned me more than I let on to them. I'm glad I finally tracked down this number." "It's good to hear your voice, Ray," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. "I need to tell you something, and I need to ask you something," he said. "First, they're finally doing it properly, Eddie. A real commemoration 50 years out for what happened that day. They want you there, not as a footnote, as the man who actually earned that cross, standing in front of people who need to understand what it actually cost." "I'm not sure I'm up for travel these days, Ray," I said, though something in his voice made the excuse feel smaller than usual. "Second thing," he continued, as though he hadn't quite heard my hesitation, or had decided not to accept it yet, "I want to come see you myself, before any of that, in person. I have some things I need to say to you that don't belong on a phone call, and frankly, Eddie, after visiting your son's house and getting the sense I got there, I think I need to see for myself how you're actually doing. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me during that conversation, because I think it matters." Something that had been quiet and folded away for years opened its eyes, not with excitement exactly, but with a kind of cautious, unfamiliar warmth, the specific feeling of being remembered, actively sought out, by someone who had once mattered enormously and whom circumstance had simply allowed to drift away. "I don't know if I have anything left worth commemorating, Ray," I said, more honestly than I'd intended. "Some days here feel like they've worn most of that man down to something smaller." "That's exactly why I need to see you," he said, his voice gentler now. "Eddie, I've buried a lot of men from that unit over the years. You're one of the last of us who was actually there that day. I'm not going to let you disappear into a facility without at least trying to remind you what you meant to the rest of us." 3 days later, Ray arrived at Willowbrook, not in uniform, dressed plainly, carrying a small folder I didn't ask about immediately. We sat together for almost 2 hours, and I want to describe what happened during that visit exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment that set everything else in motion. "Eddie," he said, partway through our conversation, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard from him before. "I went to your son's house first, before I found this number." A woman answered, his wife, I gather. "When I asked where I might find you, she seemed genuinely confused about the specifics. She knew you were somewhere with care," her words, "but she had to check with your son to confirm the actual name of the facility." "Eddie, that's not a criticism I make lightly. I've spent 30 years learning to read a room, and that room told me something I didn't like. I didn't have an easy response to that." We sat with the silence for a while. "I'd like to go back there," Ray said finally. "Today, if you're willing. I have something I think your family needs to understand, and I think it needs to come from me, in person, in a way that's harder to distance themselves from than a phone call." I agreed, more out of curiosity about what Ray had in mind than any real expectation that it would change much of anything. We drove to Bradley's house that afternoon, Ray in the dress uniform he'd changed into at his hotel beforehand, a decision he made deliberately, he told me later, because he wanted the visual weight of it to be impossible to dismiss. I want to describe this moment exactly as it happened, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened without me saying a single word to start it. Denise answered the door, her expression shifting rapidly from polite confusion to something closer to alarm at the sight of a decorated 3-star general standing on her porch. "Where is he?" Ray asked, his voice steady and urgent, the voice of a man used to commanding immediate attention. "Where is Master Sergeant Foster? I need to see him today." "I'm sorry, who?" Denise started, and then her eyes landed on me, standing quietly behind Ray, and her confusion deepened rather than resolved. Bradley appeared behind her moments later, and I watched his face go through several rapid transformations. Recognition of me first, followed by confusion at Ray's uniform, followed by a dawning, uncomfortable understanding that something significant was happening, that he didn't yet have the context to process. "Dad," he said, "what's going on? Who is this?" "This is General Raymond Ellis," I said quietly. "We served together, a long time ago." "General," Bradley repeated, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Mr. Foster," Ray said, addressing Bradley directly now, his tone shifting from urgency to something more deliberate. "I came to your house 3 days ago looking for your father, and your wife wasn't entirely certain where to find him. I want to be direct with you, because I think directness is the only thing that actually matters here. Your father earned the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors this country awards, for an action that saved the lives of 11 men in my platoon, at a cost to himself I watched firsthand and have never forgotten. I've spent 30 years of my career trying to live up to the example he set that day, and I found him living in a care facility that his own family apparently struggles to name correctly when a stranger asks where to find him. The porch was very quiet after that. "Dad," Bradley said, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, "why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" I want to answer that question honestly, the way I answered it that afternoon, because I think it matters more than the medal itself, because I didn't want you growing up measuring your father against an afternoon that also cost good men their lives. I said, "That cross isn't a trophy, Bradley. It's a reminder of the worst day of my life, I didn't hide it to seem humble. I hid it because I wanted you to know me as your father first, and as whatever that citation says second, if at all. That doesn't explain Willowbrook, Ray said, quietly but firmly. That doesn't explain 14 months, Bradley. Whatever your father chose not to tell you about his service, that's his decision to make. But a son's decision to stop showing up, that's a different matter entirely, and no amount of not knowing about a medal excuses it. Bradley didn't have an answer for that. Denise, standing beside him, had gone very pale, her hand finding his arm in a way that seemed to steady them both. General, Denise said finally, her voice small, I didn't know about any of it. I knew he was somewhere with Care, She stopped herself, apparently hearing how thin that sounded even as she said it. I'm not here to assign blame between the two of you, Ray said, his tone softening slightly. I'm here because I served alongside this man on the worst day of both our lives, and I wasn't willing to let him spend his final years forgotten by the people who owe him the most. What you do with that information now is entirely up to you. The weeks that followed were their own kind of difficult. There's a version of this story where the porch confrontation is the climax, and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Bradley visiting Willowbrook 3 times in the first 2 weeks alone, sitting with a discomfort he clearly hadn't anticipated, asking careful, halting questions about a father he realized he'd never fully known. It's Carol flying in unexpectedly the following month, having heard the full story secondhand from Bradley, sitting beside my bed with an expression somewhere between grief and shame. I told myself distance was the reason, Carol said, that first visit. But Bradley's only 20 minutes from Willowbrook, Dad. Distance was never really his excuse, and mine was thinner than I wanted to admit. I know, I said. I've known for a while now. Why didn't you ever say anything? Push us, guilt us, anything? Because guilt isn't the kind of thing I wanted from either of you, I said. I'd rather have earned real visits than manufactured ones. I'm not sure that was the right calculation looking back, but it's the one I made. Did you ever think about calling us out on it directly? Carol asked. Just saying, plainly, I need you to visit more. More times than I can count, I said. I always talked myself out of it. Told myself you both had full lives, that asking would just be adding weight to schedules already stretched thin. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me was also afraid of what it would mean if I asked directly and you still didn't come. That's the part that gets me, Carol said quietly. You'd rather sit with the loneliness than risk finding out we might say no. That's not fair to you, Dad. You deserve to ask. There was a day, about a month after Ray's visit, when Bradley asked if he could see the full citation, the complete account of that day, details I'd never shared with him. I told him some of it, enough for him to understand the shape of the day without carrying every detail of it the way I had for decades. He sat with the old paperwork for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady. 11 men, he said. You saved 11 men, and I couldn't be bothered to visit you for over a year. Those are 2 different failures, Bradley, I said. One of them was heroism under fire, decades ago, that I've spent my whole life trying to live quietly alongside rather than perform. The other is a choice you made, recently, that has nothing to do with the medal at all. I'd rather you sit with the second one honestly than use the first one to explain it away. I watched my son, in those weeks, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. I watched him show up, consistently, without needing a general's uniform on his porch to remind him. At the 50th anniversary commemoration event, months later, Bradley attended alongside me, standing quietly near the back of the room, and when a reporter covering the event asked him what it felt like to be the son of a Distinguished Service Cross recipient, he said, without hesitation, honestly, it felt like a wake-up call about how badly I'd been failing to show up for the actual man, medal or no medal. I'm working on that now, and I intend to keep working on it. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally naming something you'd been quietly carrying alone for longer than you'd admitted to yourself. I thought about Marion a great deal in those weeks, what she would have said, watching our children finally reckon with the distance they'd let grow, watching Bradley sit with real discomfort instead of rushing past it. I think Marion would have been proudest, not of Ray's uniform on the porch, but of the quiet, halting visits that followed it. It's been almost a year now. I moved out of Willowbrook 4 months ago, into a small assisted living apartment closer to Bradley's house, a change he pushed for and helped arrange himself, without needing to be asked twice. He visits most weekends now, sometimes with the grandchildren, and we don't always talk about anything important, which is its own kind of gift after a year like that one. Carol calls every week now, real conversations, rather than brief obligatory check-ins, and she's planning a visit next month, her third this year alone. Ray and I exchange letters occasionally, an old habit neither of us expected to revive after all these years. Last month, Bradley asked if he could go through the old wooden box properly, not out of urgent curiosity but out of genuine interest in knowing his father more completely. He sat with the citation and the old photographs for a long time. "Why'd you keep all of this hidden for so long?" he asked. "Not just the metal, the distance. Why didn't you fight harder to stay in our lives once things got difficult?" "Because I didn't want you to know your father as a burden," I said. "I wanted you to know him as a father, right up until the end. I still do." Some part of me thought accepting the distance quietly was its own kind of dignity. I understand now that it was mostly just fear, dressed up as patience. He looked at the old citation a long moment, then up at me. "You could have told me you needed me," he said. "Not the metal, just that. I would have listened, eventually, if you'd pushed harder." I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect their needs to take, or because we've convinced ourselves that not asking is its own form of consideration. Bradley looked at my situation for over a year and saw an inconvenience he could manage from a comfortable distance. He wasn't entirely wrong that Willowbrook was, on paper, a reasonably managed arrangement. He was wrong about nearly everything else that actually mattered. Some evenings now I sit by the window of my new apartment, which actually looks out on a small garden rather than a parking lot, and I think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent 26 years being a man very few people fully understood, not because I hid it out of shame, but because I never once thought it needed announcing. And I spent the years after that letting my own family's distance go largely unchallenged, telling myself that patience was a virtue rather than admitting it had become a kind of quiet resignation. I think too about how easy it is for distance to compound quietly, one skipped visit at a time, until 14 months have passed without anyone quite deciding that outcome on purpose. Bradley never woke up one morning and decided to abandon his father. He simply let each small postponement feel reasonable in isolation, the way most people do, until the postponements added up to something neither of us had consciously chosen. I don't say that to excuse it entirely. A year and 2 months is a long time, regardless of how gradually it accumulates. But I understand now, in a way I couldn't have understood while I was living inside that silence, how ordinary neglect usually looks nothing like cruelty from the inside of the person committing it. I don't regret keeping that citation folded away for most of my children's lives. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let that part go unspoken for so long. I'd do it again. What I do regret, deeply, is not telling Bradley and Carol, clearly and directly, how much their absence was costing me, long before a general's uniform on a porch had to say it for me. I thought quiet acceptance was a form of grace. What I've learned, watching my son finally show up consistently, is that sometimes the people we love need to be told plainly what we need from them, rather than left to guess at a need we've spent a lifetime learning to hide. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a small garden view in the evening, once the light has gone soft and the only sound left is whatever birds have decided to say about the day ending. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel diminished by the year I spent mostly alone at Willowbrook. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in a long while. Not because Ray's uniform finally got my family's attention, but because the truth about what I actually needed, and what I'd spent too long pretending I didn't, is finally sitting in the open where all of us can see it clearly. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person in the room, especially the quietest older person in your life, may be carrying a silence that isn't really peace at all, but simply the absence of anyone asking. Don't mistake someone's lack of complaint for the absence of need. And don't wait for a stranger to show up at your door demanding to know where someone is before you ask yourself the same question honestly. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder to visit. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.